Namaste and welcome to the second part of our interview with Professor Nareen. In this segment, Nareen will discuss how disparities in social issues like education, health, property ownership, and media representation affect equity, and emphasize the need for systemic change and greater inclusion to build a fairer society for a diverse Australia. To begin with, we will explore systemic racism and its effect on achieving equity. You might wonder why this is so important, but addressing racism and discrimination is crucial for achieving true equality and equity. While the challenges faced by Aboriginal and First Nation communities are unique, their experiences offer valuable lessons for other minority and migrant groups. For instance, during the voice referendum, I personally found it challenging to persuade some people who feared that recognizing Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander voices might lead to division. Nareen, how do you think the voice referendum could have more effectively tackled systemic racism and discrimination, not just for First Nations communities, but also for the other underrepresented groups? What are your thoughts on the concerns and fears expressed by some migrant communities?
Well, I don't know what they meant by that. I was really amazed that way of thinking got legs, because it seemed to me that recognition of First Nations as First Nations in the Constitution would give more power to all immigrant or minority communities. I don't think that's rocket science. Giving recognition in the Australian Constitution. The Australian nation, as we now know it, was only made in 1901, and the Constitution was formulated then, and it was a lot of white men who formed that Constitution, and it doesn't recognise that there were people here before. And that's all that First Nations did. What First Nations people wanted in terms of constitutional recognition, in terms of the Indigenous voice, we are making up for it being excluded from the education system until very recently. People of my age who were born in the same year as me were removed from their parents just for being Aboriginal. And younger than me, 10 years younger, people were still being removed for being Aboriginal. Up until 1975 in New South Wales, Aboriginal children could be excluded from school because one white person in the community asked for them to be excluded from the school. I was at school then. There was no Aboriginal person went to university in Sydney in New South Wales until 1963. So when we talk about the voice, and when you look at remote communities, some of those communities' first contact was only made with white Australia in the 1920s, so only 100 years ago. So what that was seeking was a democratic forum for those First Nations communities that are affected to have their own forum. That doesn't detract from immigrant people. It recognises that there is difference in this country. And it would have given the dominant culture an understanding that First Nations people are valid, are to be respected, and to be given a democratic forum for themselves as the First Nation. So that then would have empowered everybody. So I don't understand what the thinking was.
Absolutely. Because when we talk about equity, being part of the system which makes the policy is very, very important.
Absolutely. And that's all that was. And, Peter Dutton, who now wants to stop all immigration, was the same person that said that we shouldn't have our own voice. So people need to work out who the enemy is, I suppose.
Absolutely. Yeah, because
not Aboriginal people.
Yeah, it's absolutely well said, because this is something people need to look into. When we talk about like inclusion, people, when they move to a different country like Australia, they are kind of whitewashed. I'm very
Yeah,
sorry to use some words like that. It
yeah,
is
no,
to just
I don't
communicate.
apologize.
I don't mean to, you know, like insult anyone, but these are words which are easily understood by many. When I say whitewash,
Mm,
because my children, they're literally born and raised in Australia. They
mm,
have to learn English to survive. They
mm,
have to practice the customs of English to survive here. If they don't even get equal opportunity to practice their culture, we celebrate the customs of English. And for an example, a person like me, and I have to speak English to get recognition as a professional in this country. I speak two different languages. I can read, write in those languages. Over 30% of the population in Sydney are nearly migrants. It keeps increasing, expanding, but still, I am forced to actually sound like English.
yeah,
I have to prove. I have to write an IELTS test, and I have to say that my English is English in terms of British English. No,
yeah.
they do not even accept Indian
And
English.
to me, the recognition of First Nations cultures and um, our existence would have enhanced the capacity for this country to recognise everyone's difference and everyone's cultures. So I think the fear or the rubbish that was about, oh,
Yeah,
well, First Nations people will be special. You shot yourselves in the foot. Anyone who thought that,
yeah,
you know, made it worse for yourself.
yeah,
And the other thing that enabled that Peter Dutton really enabled was more of a normalising of racism and a lack of respect for First Nations people, and that then affects everybody. The more you normalise racism against one group, the more it becomes acceptable to be racist to everybody.
yeah, absolutely. And like, what do you actually think? Like, can you actually name some key issues that are faced by First Nations in Australia that still act as a barrier for them to access equity, because through them we can also understand how we will be deprived of certain rights, because
Well, you only have to look at the closing the gap statistics. There are more First Nations people. First Nations people have a shorter life expectancy. First Nations people have much worse health outcomes, and that is simply because up until 230 years ago, we didn't
Mhm.
eat sugar, we didn't eat flour, we didn't eat
Oh,
bread, we didn't
ah,
eat cows, we didn't eat sheep, we didn't eat, and our food was grown on soil that wasn't polluted by what are called cloven-footed animals, so cows, sheep, all of those things. The land was populated by kangaroo and wallaby and wombats and the animals that are indigenous to Australia. So since then, our health outcomes have been much worse, coupled with racism in the health system that meant we weren't allowed in hospitals, for
mm,
example.
oh,
And if we were in hospitals, it would have to be outside.
oh,
So Aboriginal people had to, the hospital wards for Aboriginal First Nations people were outside of the hospital. So until, quite recently in some places. So um, that the health one is a really good example. The education one is changing because our communities are putting the pressure on our kids to go to university now, and universities have targets for First Nations students, but employment, health, incarceration, wealth, every single outcome in life for First Nations people is lesser for First Nations people. Now, all the Voice wanted was in funding solutions for those things, a voice in saying where that money goes.
So community-based education, community-based health, and community-based employment will actually make a big difference in the success of a society, isn't it? Or else the society will be whitewashed.
Well,
Because
and there's a lot of Indigenous businesses now. A lot of Indigenous people own businesses, and I always try to spend on Indigenous businesses. So look
very
them
beautiful.
up, and if you're committed to First Nations advancement in this country, always try and spend your money on First Nations Aboriginal businesses or Indigenous businesses. But you know, we're doing a lot of the heavy lifting in our community, and all we want is a bit of, you know, a bit of working together.
Inclusion, like people need to support each other,
Yeah.
because that will be great. You know, it is like preserving culture, because we have to be very proud of living in a land which has the community, you know, world's oldest community, and they're living community, because the research is different. Like every country, you know, like they love to claim that their indigenous population is oldest, but despite all those things, based on the current research, this is a living, they are living culture. They are still living, oldest living culture, because most of the culture were actually got kind of mixed, you know, due to the time factor and all, because Australia was not invaded until like 250 odd years ago. So this culture actually got preserved by their own members. So we can say it's the oldest living culture. And
Oldest living civilization.
yeah, and as you talked about the food, everything, because um, many research suggests that Aboriginal community members, you know, the First Nations, they have a lot of health problems. So when you mentioned about the food, you know, everything was new to them. Until 100 years ago, they had different food, they had different meat, herbs, everything. Even I see their medical system, like herbal medical, Aboriginal medicine, that would also be different. You know, the body will react to certain medication.
Oh, well, that's right. And of course,
Yeah.
our health system, like yours, really went to preventing sickness.
Yeah.
And, you know, we all of the colonized nations had very sophisticated ways of preventing illness that were suitable for those places, for the climates and for the way that the environment works. And, you know, of course, then in the taking of the land, when the land was stolen by the English, a lot of our people were put onto missions and reserves and were fed rations and were prevented from hunting. So the diet was the worst possible diet that you could imagine. It was rations of flour, sugar, and tea. So most of us have health issues like diabetes that are genetic, that are related to what happened to our parents, great-grandparents, great-great-grandparents when the land was taken.
Yeah, I can see your point, because I saw a documentary. Um, the Aboriginal women, they looked very healthy. They were not overweight at all. They were not overweight at all, in perfect shape, and they looked so beautiful. But now when you see, because they eat a different food, they are not genetically mapped to digest this food and all. You know, now it's actually impacting their genes. You know, I'm not a genetic scientist and all, but it's not a rocket science. We can use our
It's not
common sense.
rocket
No,
science.
we can use our common sense. How Yeah,
Yeah.
because we say you're what you eat. So the food
Yeah.
has changed, and employment also. Like you talked about university education, I see a very small percentage of Aboriginal students go to university and those things. And again, and education is to secure a good employment for people. But when it comes to university education, do you think people need university education to have better employment, or the universities should change based on the values of the community, because they have to have courses that will be beneficial for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders, like their business oriented education, something community oriented education. Do you think there is equity for First Nations to have an education that they like? I mean,
Well, I think a bit of both. We talk about decolonising the Australian university system
yeah,
a lot. And again, when we decolonise it for First Nations people, we'll decolonise it for everybody, particularly other people who come from the other colonised nations.
yeah,
Um, and so I think it's a bit of both. I think
yeah.
we, First Nations people, are leading our own subjects. I'm developing curriculum at the moment for
Hmm.
First Nations people, for example. I think there's a lot going on at a lot of universities and within the university sector more generally. But again, it's half and half. There might be First Nations kids who want to be engineers. There might be
Yeah,
First Nations kids. There's a lot of First Nations doctors.
yeah,
There's quite a few First Nations psychologists, and
yeah,
increasingly there's more. There's a lot of First Nations allied health workers, so speech therapists and occupational therapists. And we
yeah,
need, unfortunately, whether we like it or not, and you probably see it the same for your people, we need to
yeah,
fit into the formalised system. So we
yeah,
need a degree, and we need that qualification and we need that registration. I mean, some people have a view that Australia's recognition of overseas qualifications is in and of itself quite racist, and I'm one of those people who have those views. But whether we like it or not, that's what exists. So we need to fit into that. So it's a bit of both.
yeah. And that said, do you think the system, you know, um, because every system is made of policies, rules, regulations, and all. And when the system is predominantly dominated by one community, for an example, English community or white population, and do you think they will have a better understanding about other communities and their needs? Because sometimes I find it very strange when an English person comes and say what I should like, what is good for me, what I should
Well,
prioritize.
that's all that the First Nations voice was asking for. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Because they say my priorities in life may be different from um, someone from uh, English culture. And but when they say what I should like and how I should live, what values I should embrace, I find it quite traumatic sometimes.
I think it's really traumatic. And for First Nations people, it's been 250 years of day in and day out. And it's why that I, for example, consider immigrant people so incredibly brave. And I have immigrant people on both sides of my family as well, people who
Oh,
came here to start a new life. And, many Aboriginal people do. And I respect those people, all of you, so much, because it's a traumatic thing to get up and move countries and have to fit into a dominant culture and, you know, adapt to a new place and a new way of life and all of those things. So, yeah, I agree that the dominant culture in Australia was, in inverted commas, victorious. And so it imposed its systems on every aspect of life for all of us. It is what it is at the moment, but we can influence and we can try to decolonize and we can do our best, and maybe in 200 years we'll have a whole different population.
That will be great. That will be truly diverse country in terms of respecting one another. When I talk about diversity, I mean like we need to respect each other, and
Yeah,
every culture like has to be respected. And
yes,
and because I see like a lot of news about First Nations,
yeah,
even their when you look at the property industry,
yeah,
they don't own uh, properties in Sydney. Like a very small percentage of Aboriginal communities own properties in Sydney. We talk about we start with an acknowledgement of these traditional custodians who are the landowners of this country. But when you talk about properties, when you talk about income, uh,
well,
like
that's because we don't tend to have inherited wealth
yeah,
because we were excluded, and I mean legally excluded from
yeah,
the education and employment systems up until quite recently. Our parents and grandparents and great grandparents didn't have jobs, they didn't have money, they weren't able to buy houses.
yeah,
And so very few Aboriginal people to this day have inherited wealth to buy houses. So, but as you say, it's ironic, isn't it? Because
yeah,
we were the owners of the land
yeah.
prior
You
to
can have a
colonisation. So, yeah, it's pretty funny, that
yeah.
one.
But as part of reconciliation, do you think that uh, First Nations must be given an opportunity to own land outrightly? Because in India, because I try to compare, how Indian indigenous population were reconciled. Like because people move from one state to another state in India too, but many state governments give free land. I'm talking about free land, like 5 acres of land, because they think these people deserve, whether they have uh, wealth or not, but the government think it is important for them to give the land back to the community.
Right.
So do you think such kind of thing is needed in Australia? Because I firmly believe we need to give them enough respect, and they worked very, they were not compensated
Well,
for the
it'd
work
be
they
good
did
to
as well,
happen,
isn't it?
but we
Yeah,
couldn't even get recognition in the Constitution or a
yeah,
First Nations voice. So I don't know how that's going to happen. There is a body that called Indigenous Business Australia that provides um, cheaper home loans, but people
mhm,
still have to have a deposit. They still have
okay,
to have saved up a deposit, which I think, like for young people, a lot of young people, that is the barrier, to home ownership.
yeah. Um, can't the government give, I mean, like a land or some kind of allowance for these populations so that they can have
Can
their
you
own home?
imagine the response of the rednecks? Can you imagine Peter Dutton? Can you imagine the National Party? Can you imagine the response of, the
Yeah,
idiot in the media like Ray Hadley and Ben
yeah,
Fordham to the notion that we be given some land back? I mean, like that's just again the reality. And I think, I don't know what other people do, but I own a house, well, with my partner and the
hmm,
bank.
hmm,
I own property because we were very lucky. We were right place, right time in Sydney.
yeah,
I'm encouraging my kids. They're just basically waiting for us to die.
yeah,
My son is very lucky because his partner's first generation immigrant and she bought a
yeah.
house when she was 23.
Oh,
Um,
great.
yeah, so she's very lucky, but they're very lucky. But as you know, it's very hard and in Sydney at the moment, and you just have to do what you have to do.
Yeah, but anywhere in Australia it should be hard because I think Indigenous Australians make up about 3.3, I think, of the population of Australians. And I think only four Indigenous member out of 226 total parliamentarians
Hmm.
in Australia, I think.
Hmm.
Because when the policy makers are not,
Reflective.
yeah, and so these kind of equity cannot, it's not even equity, it's about social justice too.
Well, you only
And
have to look at the makeup of the parliament to understand that
yeah,
there is systemic racism in this
yeah,
country. It doesn't reflect any of us who are the diverse mainstream of
hmm,
Australia. So, our combined populations are very high, but our institutions, like the parliament, like the judiciary, like the,
yeah.
the upper echelons of business, like the upper echelons of sport, like the upper echelons of anything, don't reflect what the community looks like.
Yeah. Um, as you rightly said, even very few people is part of media too, because media, whether it's social media, print media, whatever, it is also not represented by Aboriginal community. They don't have enough opportunity to represent. They create their own media, isn't it, like Aboriginal community? But in the mainstream media, though you can see one or two members here and there, only 1% of population, according to some research, are on air roles in television and radio. I'm talking about mainstream roles here, because every community may have their own media. It's again community centric. But when we talk about mainstream media, um, the First Nations get very less opportunity to represent. Do you think?
No, and we get one, so we get a Jez Fernandez, or we get, Tony Armstrong, or we get Indira Naidu, and we're all supposed to be grateful. And, really, we should be having our media should look like our community.
Everyone, like because when you look into the mainstream media, it feels like, as if some people are inserted into the media, like we need to put some Indian, we need to put some Aboriginal member, we need to, so that it will look inclusive.
Like Australia. We're not asking for anything special. We're just
Yeah,
asking our institutions to look like our country.
absolutely. Thank you really very much. I really can't thank you enough, because I see we can discuss a lot of things. Time is a barrier. With 30
It
minutes,
is.
I
Yeah.
think we went beyond the time too. Um, a lot of challenging issues are there, and when I actually wanted to do this interview with you, I wanted to understand the challenges of this community, because knowledge is transferable. When
That's
you
right.
understand, the challenges and how these people are overcoming the challenges, now this can actually help other communities to overcome their challenges and barriers. We can follow the successful, methods and strategies of this community. So, look, what would you like to share with all the migrant and refugee communities, or any community that are new to Australia, which is not a mainstream community? Because what are the successful strategies that help Aboriginal community to come back? Because we can see a resurgence, like because
Yeah, languages
yeah,
and yeah,
everything.
no,
Yeah,
our community is doing the heavy lifting. First of all, I'd like to say I'm so glad you're here. Um, I Again, as I said, I'm not just a First Nations person. I'm a person who comes from a background of immigrants and diversity.
yeah,
This is a beautiful place
yeah,
that we're so lucky to be in. And I think it's important that you do understand that First Nations people were here Our civilization is 65,000 years old, and we looked
Wow.
after this land and water for all those years. And it's only the last 250 years that things have gone to shit, really, in the environment. Sorry for using that word. But I think what you have to do is just keep trying and keep going and keep trying for equity and representation. And we are the diverse mainstream of Australia.
My sincere thanks to Professor Nareen Yang for this fantastic conversation. Thank you all for joining this important discussion on the equity of First Nations and its broader impacts on diverse Australia. This conversation with Nareen also highlighted the need for fair land rights, the impact of historical policies, and true reconciliation. I believe supporting First Nations not only addresses their needs, but also benefits all marginalized groups. I dedicate this podcast to the advocates working towards equity and social justice for everyone. I'm excited to bring you more insightful discussions in the future. Your patience and support as I refine my approach are greatly appreciated. Together, let's work towards a fairer, more inclusive future. Thanks, everyone.